Now listen up, you little turd birds. Practice starts at 11 o'clock. If you are not stretched 5 minutes early, then you are 45 minutes late. You understand me? Do you understand me?
Yes, Coach.
Okay, good. Now start touching your toes. Touch your toes. Those are your feet fingers. Let's go, dummies. Touch your toes. And touch each other's toes.
What?
You heard me. Touch each other's toes. Y'all, I don't want to hear it. Hands on toes. Someone else's toes besides your own.
What muscle is this working?
Don't worry about it. The only muscle I don't want to see working right now is your mouth, Colin. Throw this.
Yes.
Rush. Bump a catch.
Sorry, Coach.
Okay, you're sorry. Hey, I know y'all don't think it's a big deal messing up on these drills. But let me tell you this right now. The day we stop doing things the right way means we are one day closer to doing everything the wrong way. And what happens after that, huh? What, you want to make this ball your girlfriend? You want to start taking the places under your arm? Having people compliment how you all look together? And then what, you start caressing it and playing with, like, little air hole nub? Yeah? Messing around with that? Making out with it? Making it your girlfriend? Is that what you want to do? Then what, ask it to marry you? Huh? Y'all want to be married to a ball? No. What'd you say? I said no. Congratulations, Isaac. That smart mouth of yours just earned you and the entire team 10 laps. Let's go. Oh, guess what? Make it 1,000 laps. That's your fault, too. 1,000 laps. Off you go. Let's go. Run. Run. Yeah, there you go. Get them knees up. Get them by your nipples. I hope y'all drink a lot of water today, because y'all going to be so dehydrated that you're going to look like one of them trees from a Tim Burton movie. I'm talking any Tim Burton movie. Even Dumbo. Even friggin' Dumbo.
So if you're confused as to what you just listened to, then you're missing out. That was a scene from the TV show Ted Lasso, which is on Apple TV. And from a guy who rarely watches any TV, it's must-watch TV. The scene is comically called Lead Tasso, and the head soccer coach, who's usually a positive, upbeat, transformational coach, well, he changes himself intentionally into what he calls Lead Tasso and rips into his players with threats and insults, all in an effort to get them to snap out of some mid-season complacency. Now, it's funny, but I also think all of us at some stage, we've had our own Lead Tasso moments, or maybe we still have them. For those of us who still use threats to motivate our players, well, today might challenge your current approach to coaching, the way you discipline, the way you choose to motivate, or even the way you try to build the character of your players. Now, I want to preface this episode by saying, if you still use threats, we're not saying you are a bad coach or that you have been doing bad things. We're just talking about how all of us, because we all do it, even Ted Lasso, all of us can do better. We can start to see player mistakes. That's the lack of effort, poor attitude, or anything that really sets us off as a coach. These are opportunities to strengthen the relationships, to build their character, to raise standards in our program, and to increase the motivation of our players, the good kind, the inner motivation. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast. I'm JP Nervin, joined by my co-host and friend, Nate Sanderson. Our next two episodes are a continuation from our series on discipline with Dr. Jay Nelson. Discipline is important, vitally important to culture. And we've talked a lot about it, and I've written quite a bit as well, which is why I have put together the Transformational Discipline Toolbox PDF. It is a document full of articles, podcasts, and notes on ways to better discipline. How do you get this PDF? All you gotta do is subscribe to our weekly newsletter at thriveonchallenge.com or using the link in the details of this episode. You don't want to miss it.
JP, I'm excited to wander out on a limb here this week with you as we take on maybe 100 years of coaching tradition, talking about, questioning, and just having a discussion around the idea of, is it useful and is it the best practice to use threats toward our players, whether that's physical or emotional, in order to get compliance? Do the ends justify the means in terms of how we are dealing with our players in practices and games? And before we get into, maybe why that's not always the best approach, Wondering, JP, if you could give us a few of your favorites, some of the most common ways that you see coaches using punishment or threat to try to coerce their players into compliance.
So if I was honest, I feel pretty equipped to give some examples because I'm very familiar with these motivational tools, we might call them for a second, to kind of get my players to do what I want them to do. I mean, the first is obviously the physical punishment. We've all said, like, hit the line, and we will put all our players on the line to run because we don't feel their effort is where we want it to be. Though I think one of the more unique ways of doing that is to get everybody on the line except the player that's not working hard, so that we can then, put everybody else through this physical punishment, so that the player that wasn't working hard actually feels bad about it, So it's a clear, shaming type tactic. And I will have to admit, I've tried that one out a few times as well. It's not all, though, the physical punishment, the threat of the line or the treadmill or the bike, or whatever we want it to be. I think probably the one that I experienced the most as a player, and then as a coach, I kind of fell into the trap of using, was that emotional type punishment, those emotional threats. For me, I'm a bit of a hothead as a coach at times. I get quite passionate. That passion can sometimes be a good thing to fire up my team, to bring energy. But when things don't go well, we often yell at our players, and there's definitely been moments where it's in a game and the gym is full and I've been shouting across the court, yelling at my player that he's going to stop being so lazy, needs to start hustling back on defense. I've done that, and I see that all the time. Other coaches, maybe not yell as much, but we're going to stop the practice. And we're going to really point out and highlight one player that has failed to do their job. We're going to do it in a really kind of a stern manner that kind of honestly is embarrassing for that athlete. It could have been probably a little bit more of a side conversation, but we felt it was important that everyone knows that Johnny wasn't working hard, or that Johnny didn't sprint back on defense, and that we don't tolerate that here. Now, the other threat that we like to use as coaches is the blame game. And I hear a lot of talk in the social media world for players to not blame others, to complain. But we as coaches can be just as guilty of this. There's been multiple times where post game, I felt it was necessary and effective to start to point out the faults of our players that led to that loss. That's blaming. We're making them feel bad because we want them to change. The last one I want to really mention here, though, is labeling. I think a lot of times, we may not call our players names, though we've seen that, and you can go out in many youth tournaments and see youth coaches, calling their players names. There's been examples of that, but even just labeling players as lazy or you're entitled, and using those type of labels to try to get them to gain greater self-awareness and make changes in their behavior. Now, I'm sure we could add a few others to the list of threats, but those are the ones I see the most common. And I guess it begs the question of, why do we still use these type of tactics? Even though at the end of the day, I don't think it ever feels good for us, even as coaches, and it sure as heck doesn't feel good for our players.
Well, JP, I think there's a couple reasons why this has been accepted as the norm in coaching for a number of years. One is just the models that we've experienced ourselves as coaches often included these kinds of behaviors. And particularly if we experience success as an athlete with a coach that used threats to manipulate our effort or to manipulate our performance in some way, then there's kind of that survivor bias that says, well, I got through it. We were better because of it. This is how I was coached. And so this is how I might end up coaching my team, when I become a coach. I think this kind of coaching is often celebrated. When we think about the movies that we watch, I think of Miracle as an example, and there's this moment, this pivotal moment in the movie where, the U.S. Olympic hockey team is on the ice in an exhibition game and they don't give great effort. And Herb Brooks comes out and sends them back out onto the ice after the game and skates them, until they're going to throw up. And then one of the players, eventually says, oh, we play for the United States of America. And it's like the pivotal moment in that movie that changes the course of that team. And you feel it when you watch that scene, when they unite around the flag, but it was caused because of a punishment, and there's lots of examples of that just in Hollywood and in the media and the stories that are told on Twitter and in books about how teams become successful. I think the other reason why this is commonplace, our friend Mano Watsa would say, it's because it works. In the short term, the threat of punishment, the threat of humiliation, the threat of being called out in front of your peers, the threat of going on the line or putting the basketballs away or getting on the treadmill, whatever it might be, is a short-term motivator that can change behavior in the moment. What Mano would argue, and I would agree with this, is that when we use these kind of threatening tactics, it costs a little bit of our dignity, and it costs the dignity of our players. In a sense, it's communicating as a human being, you don't have enough to get where we want to go. So I've got to threaten you in another way. And I think, JP, the same thing could be said about us as coaches. In those moments where we resort to using the threat of punishment or the threat of embarrassment or humiliation or whatever it might be, how many times have we heard a coach say, God, I hate getting on my guys so much, but I don't know how else to motivate them. There's a part of us that feels a little bit of lack of dignity in ourselves, that like that statement represents, I wish that I knew a better way, but they just won't respond, or I don't necessarily know how to do it. So I resort to the thing that I know will work in the short term, even if it isn't what I want in the long term.
If I was honest, this type of coaching, this type of transactional approach to disciplining our players and these type of threats to get them to comply, I think this is what has really pushed me to try to find a better way of coaching, to understand what transformational coaching looks like, because I started to see the long-term effects of this on my players and on myself. You hit it right on the head. I wasn't feeling good about it. I was getting exhausted by the end of the year, feeling like I had to constantly hold them accountable in those ways. And that's the case because my players are only extrinsically motivated to work hard, to have a good attitude, and to be grateful because I'm threatening them. And if they don't, then there's some backlash. There's that emotional or physical threat always waiting for them. So you have to bring that as a coach every day, or else the player's motivation drops. But probably more than just the exhaustion of having to constantly hold them accountable or discipline them in those ways was the effect on the relationship. So when we choose to discipline our players in such a way, what we get is one of 4 different types of responses that Jay Nelson talks about in positive discipline. You get resentment. They resent you as their coach. You get revenge, right? They might try to lash back out at you. You get rebellion. Definitely experienced a lot of that. And you get this reduced self-esteem. You're not helping to develop the mental health and the confidence within your players when you do that. And so as I started to experience those effects on my players, and honestly, even somewhat within myself, I started to resent my players because I always had to yell at them. That really was a turning point for me to say, gosh, there's got to be a better way of doing this. I didn't know what it was. And that was really frustrating because I was like, well, what is the better way? And I don't want to become permissive. I don't want to just let them off the hook for things. But it was really frustrating as a coach. And so I think a lot of coaches in that place where they don't change because they just don't know a better way.
JP, if you were to ask me why I think these strategies aren't great long-term, I would add another R, and that is that players are repelled. When you think about trying to build relationships with somebody, I don't care if it's your kid, your spouse, your coworker, your players, whoever it might be, when you are constantly or even occasionally relying on threats to get to compliance, that is a withdrawal in that relationship. It creates uncertainty and unpredictability. It makes it feel like it's an unsafe environment. It's unsafe to be me and give my best effort, because what if it's not good enough? I'm going to be attacked, in some way or another. And that, by just the nature of how our brains are wired, causes us to be repelled from that person. It creates distance. It creates an obstacle and a barrier to relationship. And at the end of the day, that probably bothers me as much as anything else, because for me as a transformational coach, or at least making an attempt to be a transformational coach, the thing that I want to last beyond what happens on the court is the relationship. And so I don't want to sabotage my own ability to have a lasting impact on a kid because I don't know another way of doing it. And look, we want to make it really clear that that doesn't mean that if you use these methods, you can't build a relationship with your player, can't build a relationship with your student. It just means that it becomes a little bit more difficult. It requires more deposits to counterbalance that. It takes more effort, right? And to me, when I think about that, like, why would I want to sabotage my own ability and make it more challenging to build a healthy relationship with a player that can have an impact beyond what they do with the ball on the court?
So Nate, I want to add one more R here, and that is regulation. There's certain times where we as a coach try to step in and help our players adjust their attitude or their behavior when they may be going through a stressful experience. All right. They may have experienced a challenge, made a mistake, and they're sulking or they're frustrated or they lash out at a teammate or they lash out at the referees. And oftentimes my response was to come in with anger and threats. And I got hot, I got angry, and I got emotional. Now, we've had Dr. Bruce Perry on the podcast before, and he has a line from his work that has always stuck with me. And that is, a dysregulated person can never regulate another person. And what he's talking about there is when someone is having an emotional response, if we come in there and we add more emotion to it, it doesn't help them. It only makes it worse. And so for us as coaches, we have to regulate, we have to be in control of our emotions if we want to help our players in the emotional moments.
JP, here's another perspective that has helped to keep me in check a little bit over the years. You know, when I feel like lashing out or making a threat in practice, you know, to get us to increase our effort or focus or whatever it might be. And that is, in the back of my mind, I just ask myself, would I be able to act this way or say this thing or speak with this level of emotion in the classroom? In other words, if I was in the classroom and I'm teaching math and I've got students that are struggling to carry the one when they're doing addition, would I lash out at them and yell at them and threaten to take away recess if they don't carry the one, or threaten to make them run laps around the classroom, or call them lazy or stupid, or tell them that they never do it right? Or, you know, none of those things would be accepted in the classroom. And quite frankly, there are very few places in society where that kind of leadership style is acceptable anymore, because I think we start to realize that's not the best way to tap into a person's potential. So just asking that question, is this something I could do in the classroom, sometimes helps to moderate my response in those moments where I want to challenge my team in that way.
Yeah, I love that, because coaches often say, hey, I'm just trying to prepare them for the real world, but the real world doesn't operate that way anymore. Might have 50 years ago, not anymore. And at the end of the day, I think we need to remember that our most powerful tool as a coach is our own example. And so we need to model the type of leadership that would help them to be successful later in life, but also to be successful within our own team. And that's probably not how we want them to treat their teammates when their teammates don't do what they're supposed to do, or their teammates' effort drops. We have a different expectation so often. At least I know I had a very different expectation of my players and the way that I wanted them to hold each other accountable. And for some reason, I had a double standard there, and that doesn't work. We need to be the example. So we've laid out a bunch of reasons why threats are not beneficial. They're not effective in the long term. And I think it really begs the question now of, well, is there a better way? Is there a better way of holding our players to a standard of stepping in and disciplining them?
Well, obviously, JP, we think there is, or we wouldn't be having this conversation here this week. So here's one perspective that's been helpful for me. And I stole this from Mano Watsa from Point Guard College, but I love the way that it frames the idea of accountability and consequence. Because again, sometimes we get pushback and say, well, we just don't hold our players accountable at all. Like, we can't have consequences for negative behaviors or not meeting standards. And that's not the case. What Mano talks about is when we use punishments, oftentimes we're looking backwards. No, we're saying that wasn't good enough, and so here's the consequence for that. But we don't necessarily prepare them for the challenge by looking forward. And here's what I mean by that. If effort has been an issue for you in practice, and instead of just coming out with a threat of, look, if we don't work hard today, or if we don't give better effort than this, we're going to get on the line, we're going to lock the balls up, we're going to turn this into track practice. You know, it's preparing the players ahead of time. We've got to practice harder Here's why, right? So we're creating a challenge for them prior to their execution of that effort. We're creating a why. Why does it matter? Why does our effort matter as we get ready for our opponent on Friday? And we're driving toward a solution of how can we support each other to give better effort today, either as teammates or as coaches, or even for themselves individually. What can they do to bring a better effort? Then when the challenge is laid out, and we've talked about potential solutions and interventions that can help us to raise our effort level, it doesn't mean that there can't be a consequence on the other side of that, but we're doing it in a way that prepares them and engages them and brings them into the process, rather than just looking back and saying, that wasn't good enough, you're not good enough, now we're going to get on the line.
Well, I think it's really important to note that I'm not and you're not against consequences, but I think there is a difference when the players have agreed to that consequence, or they've said we've accepted that consequence. And so that if then statement can actually be flipped. So instead of saying, hey, if you guys don't work hard, then you're going to have to run, we could ask our team instead, hey, if we're not giving great effort in practice this season, if our mistake response isn't great within practice, then what are some solutions? Now, sometimes when you ask your team that, they may say the bike, they may say hit, some running. And then that becomes a consequence and less of a punishment, because a punishment is you doing to them, and a consequence they see as they've done to themselves. They made the choice to not give great effort, and so they're going to accept the consequence. Now, if you just think that's semantics, I would beg to differ. So just one example from me as a parent in the house that I've learned from positive discipline, for instance. I used to use if-then statements all the time. If you don't go upstairs, brush your teeth, go to the bathroom and get ready for bed right now, then you're not going to get this. You're not going to get dessert. You're not going to get to do this tomorrow. I use threats a lot. And one simple change in my language has drastically changed that experience around bedtime routine. Now I say, hey, as soon as you get ready for bed, we can come downstairs and we can read stories. As soon as you get ready for bed, do your bedtime routine, we can sit down and play a game tonight before bed. That change in language is empowering, not threatening. It's saying, hey, you have the control. As soon as you're ready, we'll go. And so little changes like that, little changes in the way that we talk about consequences or solutions drastically changes how our players will feel in those moments.
And when we think about the drivers of human behavior, if you're talking about Daniel Pink in his book Drive, and he talks about autonomy as being one of the critical factors for engagement, that's exactly what you're describing. We're ceding some control over consequence to the players or to the team to make that decision for themselves. Dr. Perry talks about trying to build resiliency in young people. One of the three key factors is that it's controllable, that they feel like they have some control over it. And again, when you do that in advance, it allows them to feel like it's theirs, as opposed to, well, I gave you your chance, it wasn't good enough, so now I got to step in and bring the hammer, whether that's emotionally or physically, bringing a threat or consequence to change their behavior. JP, this kind of reminds me of my first foray into trying to do things differently. I remember in 2014 was the first year that we had used wristbands, and we put a phrase on there that said, what would Pow do? And that was kind of an inside joke on our team about one of our seniors whose nickname was Pow. And they really encouraged me before I was going to fly off the handle in practice that year to ask myself, what would Pow do? And so in practice, it kind of became this running joke as I would start to get heated and they would see I'd start to get a little agitated with how we were practicing. I'd start to rub this wristband and I'd walk over to Pow at the end of a line or on the sideline. And I'd say, is now the time for me to step out? Is now the time for me to intervene? And she would always say, no, coach, we'll take care of it. And then she would become more vocal and the captains would try to get everybody to step it up. And for the most part, that worked. And what it did is it allowed me to have some space to cede control over to the team, right? To give them ownership and say, look, we can all recognize this isn't quite good enough in this moment. But rather than, the rage monster coming out and trying to fix the problem, it gave them the first opportunity. And of all the things that we talked about before, that enhances our relationship, that enhances their engagement, that gives them ownership and autonomy. It allows them to find a solution in the moment without relying on my threats to change our behavior.
And what we're really talking about here is the difference between calling your players out and calling your players up. And that is not easy. It requires a lot of intentionality. It requires you kind of retraining the way that you operate when things don't go well or your players don't work hard. And it takes years of practice. And we're still all working on it every practice, every day of our life.
This is where I would encourage coaches, that are searching for a better way, a different way to change their players' behaviors, to start with a simple conversation, asking your team, what do you want me to do when we don't meet the standards? And just allowing them to begin to articulate and to talk amongst themselves. Can they find a solution, teammate to teammate, before it gets to the level where the coach has to intervene? And then asking them, what do you need from me? Now, your players might say, well, coach, we need you to get on us. We need you to step in and be a little fiery and put us on the line and call us out when we're not meeting the standard. And what I would respond, to players that say that, is that, what are you going to do in life when I'm not there? If you need that to be a great mother or a great wife or a great spouse, you need somebody to get in your face and challenge you and call you out. What are you going to do when I'm not there to do that for you? Like, we want to get beyond that level of motivation. That's part of building the character of our players, that they can find that within rather than relying on it from somebody else. And that would be my challenge to them. How can you do this for yourself and for each other rather than relying on my intensity or my responses to motivate you to get where we all want to go?
So at the time of editing this episode, on social media, a video of Trent Dilfer, who's a former NFL quarterback and now a high school football coach, well, the video went viral. And it's not just of him yelling and screaming at a player, but it's of him grabbing a player by his pads and shoving him backwards. Now, obviously, this type of coach behavior, it crossed many lines and is unacceptable. And that doesn't really need a discussion. But I think two things are worth mentioning. First, I think sometimes I used to see videos like that, or videos of Bob Knight, screaming and yelling at his players. And I would think, well, I'm not that bad. When we start saying that, that's a warning sign. When we start to defend our actions as not having crossed the line or not having gone too far, we need to just take a step back and ask ourselves, is the way I'm coaching the best way to coach? Secondly, we will all make mistakes. I don't know Trent, but he has released a statement taking 100% ownership of how unacceptable his behavior was and how he failed as a leader to be in control of his emotions. He failed to set the example. I hope, regardless of how big or small our mistake is, or how much in the public or private eye our own failings are, that we as well will take ownership of our mistakes, because those are powerful learning and growth moments for ourselves and for our players. Now, if you want to learn more about a better way to discipline, download the Transformational Discipline Toolbox PDF. It's 100% free. All you need to do is be a subscriber to the TOC newsletter. You can do that by going to thriveonchallenge.com or using the link in the details of this episode.